Hi, my name's Sheehan and today I'd like to talk about Sibelius's Fifth Symphony in E-flat major. I'd like to go through each of the three movements, exploring how this marvellous symphony is put together. Sibelius originally composed this for his 50th birthday in 1915. Sibelius, of course, being a Finnish national hero, and there was a big celebration to celebrate his 50th, and he composed this symphony for this occasion. But that wasn't the version that we know today, although that version has been recorded in recent years. Sibelius took this work and he started revising it quite extensively, and by the time we get to 1919, he'd completely altered the work. Bits and pieces come back from the original version, but it's very much in a different structure, much tighter in terms of its form, and very original as well. This symphony has got to be one of the most original symphonies ever written. It was first performed in Helsinki in 1921. And then since then it's just become, you know, one of Sibelius' most well known and regarded as one of his greatest works. Sibelius' music is just so distinctive, isn't it? You just hear it and you think, yes, this is an individual voice. At the very beginning of this symphony we have this E-flat major chord, we have the B flat in the timpani, and above it we have unforgettably that horn call. And this is at the beginning of the Exposition, if you like. Now, Sibelius uses sonata form in such an original way in this first movement. And in actual fact, the first movement is really two movements squashed together, but in this seamless and masterful way. It doesn't sound like two different movements put together at all. It just sounds like one piece of cloth, as it were. But it's just, you can really break it down into a sonata form section and then something akin to a scherzo. And the sonata form section, the beginning of this movement, is just filled with ideas, short ideas. That's the first one, those horn calls we just heard, and those wind ideas above, which get slightly more florid as we carry on. So there's a little tail of semiquavers added there. Eventually, on the oboes, we hear this rather more sombre idea in thirds. So that kind of sinuous idea. And then we suddenly notice the strings. They come in with this creeping, this ascending chromatic idea. And above that we hear this more strident idea in the woodwinds. Then that carries on, the strings keep rising, and then we hear the next phrase of that melody. And then we hear another idea, a fourth idea in this exposition, which goes like this. which is like a rising idea, like going up the scale. And then we have one last idea, which Michael Steinberg calls a Scotch snap idea, this da-da-da-da-da. And so on. And that ends, if you like, the exposition. Now, some people have tried to divide this into a first subject group and a second subject group. But I think if you're doing that with this piece, you're kind of missing the point of the way Sibelius composes at this point in his life. But it's certainly an exposition of some kind with 5 different ideas. Fragments of ideas, I guess, really. And then, in a very innovative way, he repeats that exposition, but it's not a direct repeat. We hear the same ideas, those calls, this time a bit more confidently. And then back to the trumpet again. We hear that, we hear those ideas, those oboe ideas in the thirds again. And then we hear just a couple of bars, almost as if they're not important, they're just thrown there like this. In the flute and bassoon, and now become more important in a development. And one feature of this repeat of the exposition is the strings, the buzzing strings underneath, this kind of continual kind of kinetic energy. The strings that kind of thing underneath. This buzzing away. I heard someone talk about the Sibelius symphonies once, and apparently there's a kind of mosquito in the Finnish countryside which they think Sibelius may have been painting, because these kind of buzzing string parts occur in many of his symphonies, of course. We then have the repeat of that D and E ideas, motifs with the Scotch snap, and then we're into the development. And the development begins with this this descending chromatic idea on the horns. And then the strings join in with that idea. And so on, and they develop that idea, almost turning it into a fugue. And over the top of this idea, which gets more and more hectic, the strings becoming more and more, creating this rather paranoid, anxious backdrop. Over the top, remember those 2 rather inconsequential bars of flute and bassoon before in the second exposition, the repeat of the exposition. Well, this time they developed more into a theme which starts off with clarinet and bassoon, but then is the bassoon solo marked lugubre and patetico, kind of really sad and solemn. That kind of goes something like this, but the time the bassoon's playing, it's like this. And so on. Very expressive solo. I heard a talk on this symphony once by the broadcaster and writer Stephen Johnson, and he said this part seems to tie in with what Sibelius wrote in one of his letters. He wrote, "In a deep valley again, but I already begin to see dimly the mountain that I shall certainly ascend." We're certainly in a deep valley here, a deep valley of anxiety and depression, it seems, in the heart of this development with this bassoon solo. But what is the mountain he's about to climb? Well, before we reach the summit, we've got more music of struggle. We have a version of that strident angular theme from the Exposition and the violins. Something like that. We have these rather dissonant swelling chords in the woodwinds and horns, and then eventually that builds and builds, that music of struggle, and we hit the peak. We're now in B major and we have some kind of recapitulation in this wonderfully exhilarating passage in this symphony. Back to those horn calls from the beginning. Here Sibelius kind of morphs this sonata, this loose sonata form movement into something akin to a scherzo. Imperceptibly, the music seems to gather speed and the meter changes. We go from 12/8 into 3/4, but the dotted crotchet becomes the dotted minim of each bar. So there's this kind of uniformity, even though the music's a lot faster. And we have this idea, which is based on that horn call idea, kind of a dance tune. We eventually move back to E flat major, but it's still basically that idea. And then we come to this trumpet melody, which marks another section, perhaps a trio section, if this was a standard scherzo. But the music is just getting is still in this extremely quick one in a bar pulse. That tune is thrown around the orchestra, sometimes in an imitative way, in the strings. And eventually that builds up a head of steam. It gets more and more exciting. The horns come in, cutting across that 3 with 2 dotted crotchets in each bar, da, 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 and we come to this massive climax where we hit the coda, which I think is one of the most thrilling codas in any symphony. And it's here that the brass ring out almost like bells, these short ideas based on that opening horn call. And you suddenly realise the music has gathered such a pace. I always think this music, it always takes me by surprise when you suddenly hear the violins playing the arpeggios at the end of this, because you suddenly realise that this movement, which started off in such a stately fashion, has suddenly become terrifyingly fast. It's almost as if you're on a train and you look out the window and you suddenly realise how fast you're going. And we have these arpeggios at the end in the violins. And it's such an incredibly exciting end of any movement. You just want to jump out of your seat in sheer exhilaration, if it's conducted properly, that is. The second movement is essentially a theme and 5 variations, and a rather simple, charming, almost folk-like idea. It's very much a kind of intermezzo in this symphony, a break between the weight of the first and final movements. It's not completely untroubled though. There are moments of uncertainty which penetrate into this rather untroubled exterior. The theme basically is this. After a brief introduction, we hear it on the flutes. And the violins, pizzicato. So that gentle theme is repeated time and time again in this movement. And the second time we hear it varied, something like this. And so on. Very elegant, graceful music. And then this variation, it suddenly slows down, gets rather more ardent in nature. And then we go back to this again. And so on. The second variation, we move into C minor. And then in the third variation, we're back in G major, and it's like this again. There's a lot of this string crossing. And so on. Very light music. But then there's ripples on this surface. We suddenly hear this. The music darkens. The music gets rather chromatic and dissonant here. Very much a darker version of that rather innocent theme. The last variation takes us back to the sunny simplicity of the opening. The third movement of Sibelius' Fifth Symphony is a mighty and glorious and hugely life-affirming way to end this marvellous symphony. We're back in E flat major, the home key of the symphony here, and essentially this remarkable movement is based on two alternating ideas, well, almost alternating anyway. We have this quick scurrying idea, which perhaps reminiscent of that Scherzo passage from the first movement. We have this idea. And the strings just scurry away like that, with these brief timpani interjections. And then eventually we hear this fragment of a tune in the cellos and basses. This is reminiscent of a bass line we heard in the second movement actually. But here it heralds the new section in this movement, which I call section B. And this is the famous melody, which Sibelius was apparently inspired to write after seeing a flock of swans take flight. What an amazing sight that must have been, and it really must have stirred his heart to produce this wonderful melody. We first hear it in the horns. And so on. We know that this is going to be the melody to take us right to the very end of this remarkable symphony. And over that swinging melody in the horns, we have this additional counter melody on the oboes and flutes. And then we kind of break into C major, this wonderful modulation from E flat major to C major. We suddenly go. And then here, listen out for the double basses. They've got a really great part here. Completely, you know, by themselves. Listen, if you see it live, watch out for the bassist really giving it some welly there. A really terrific part. Eventually we go back to the A section again, that Scherzo melody. This time it's more of a development of that idea. We flip through different keys. That kind of idea comes back almost as half forgotten memory sometimes. We have a slightly different variant on the oboe. And so on. So this is a rather dark, shadowy section in this movement. But then everything kind of settles down. And we have another striking modulation, this time to G flat major. And this time we hear the A tune played again. And so on and so forth. 3 Ps, very quiet indeed. And then we come back to that swinging swan melody again. And then over the top we hear the flutes again. These long woodwind lines over boom, 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 boom. We then come to a more serious variation like this. We kind of reach a climax which is rather emotionally raw. But then we settle down once more into E flat major, and we have the trumpets ringing out the swan tune now. And what's interesting here, Sibelius, he puts the double basses kind of out of sync with that tune. So there's this kind of restlessness underneath that static melody. Da, 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 kind of helps propel the music. But this time the music gets extremely complex in terms of its harmony and its texture. All of a sudden that bass line, that da, 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 is taken up by the whole string section. And we still have that kind of that bell-like melody over the top tolling out with that rhythm in the strings cutting across. And then we have some really crashing dissonances in this part of the symphony. It really sounds incredibly modern all of a sudden. This symphony is rather, although it's tonal, it has got this sheen of modernity about it, but it's perhaps most apparent in this passage here, where we come to this almighty coda, where the trumpets blare out basically the first three notes of that. And then we have the most remarkable final 9 bars of this symphony. What a stroke of genius this is. The whole orchestra just stops and we have these crashing chords. And that's the end of this remarkable symphony by Sibelius. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If this is your kind of thing, please subscribe and please like this video, and please suggest any pieces of music you'd like me to have a look at, and I'll add them to my list. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.